Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here for this one. It's going to be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So, I was thinking about this the other day. When you break a bone, right? An X-ray shows you exactly where the fracture is.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Just a stark white line on a black background.
Right, and the doctor just points to it and says, there it is. It's totally binary. It's broken or it's not.
It's clean, and honestly, it's really comforting in a way.
It is. We really like our problems to be visible and just easily categorized like that.
For sure. But human conflict doesn't really work that way.
No, not at all. What happens when the fracture isn't in a bone, but in a relationship? What happens when the break is this ultimate betrayal?
Yeah, like a stolen fortune or maybe a runaway employee.
Exactly. Or just a completely shattered friendship. You can't just shove human conflict into an X-ray machine and find the exact point of the break.
And you definitely can't figure out exactly how to set it so it heals perfectly either.
Right. It's just a mess.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
Human conflict is just incredibly messy.
Oh, absolutely.
And resolving it, it requires this level of nuance, this deep psychological maneuvering that just completely defies those simple binary solutions we always crave.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is so fascinating to me. We are looking at a text that acts as this masterclass in resolving the unresolvable.
A true masterclass. We're unpacking the biblical Book of Philemon today.
Yeah, and the setup here is just incredible. We're using the World English Bible text for this and pairing it with historical and theological insights from Albert Barnes' notes and Matthew Henry's complete commentary.
Both incredible sources for really digging into the context here.
Definitely. And our mission today is really to act as guides, helping you, the listener, extract some practical wisdom and life application from this text. Because this isn't some massive theological treatise sent to a whole nation.
No, not at all. It's not a rigid list of abstract rules or anything like that.
It's just this short, highly personal, brilliantly constructed ancient letter. And it deals with a very specific, very thorny interpersonal drama.
It's a highly localized, intimate dispute, yet somehow it contains these explosive, universal principles for reconciliation.
Right, principles about grace and persuasion.
Exactly. The core issues we see in this letter-like betrayal, or the assertion of rights versus the extension of grace.
Oh, and the steep cost of forgiveness.
Yes, those are just as relevant in a modern corporate boardroom or, a family living room today as they were in the first century Roman Empire.
Okay, so imagine the tension of this moment for a second. Let's just put ourselves there. A runaway thief shows up at your door.
Not a great start to the day.
No, he betrayed you, he stole from you, and he fled. But now he's back.
And he's holding a letter.
Right, a letter that basically forces you to completely hit pause on your anger. But before we even look at what that letter says, we have to understand who wrote it.
Because the author changes the entire dynamic of the situation.
Completely. So it's written by the Apostle Paul.
But he's not writing this from some comfortable ivory tower academy or a plush office somewhere.
Right. The text tells us right away. It says, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus. He is an aging man, and he is quite literally locked up in Rome.
And we really need to sit with the reality of that setting for a moment, because it's crucial.
Yeah. Paint that picture for us. What was it actually like?
Well, to be a prisoner in the ancient Roman penal system is, it's no comfort. It is dark, it is dangerous, and it's incredibly socially degrading.
I can't even imagine.
But Matthew Henry points out something fascinating here. To be a prisoner specifically for your faith, for preaching this shared gospel, that actually gives Paul immense relational leverage.
Wait, leverage. Hold on. How does being chained up in a dungeon give you leverage over a wealthy, comfortable guy living hundreds of miles away?
Well, because he isn't asking for a favor from a place of power,
Yeah.
He's asking from a place of intense shared suffering.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. A petition from someone who is actively enduring brutal hardship for the exact same beliefs you hold dear that carries a unique weight.
It's almost undeniable.
Exactly. He isn't some bureaucrat issuing an edict. He's a spiritual mentor bearing the literal scars of the movement.
Right. When a guy like that asks you for something, you listen.
You absolutely listen.
That makes total sense. So it's moral authority rather than positional authority.
Yes, perfectly said.
And the person he's writing to Philemon, he is basically the exact opposite of Paul in terms of his current comfort level.
Oh, completely. Philemon is a wealthy, prominent Christian living in the city of Colossae.
Paul even calls him a beloved fellow worker, right?
Yeah, and he's so committed that he actually hosts a church in his own house.
Which is a really crucial detail for the context here.
It really is. In the ancient world, before dedicated, freestanding church buildings were really a thing, the home was the absolute center of religious life.
Like a sanctuary.
Barnes talks about how these wealthy households were meant to be nurseries of religion, places of complete safety and moral order.
But clearly, that setting doesn't guarantee any immunity from betrayal.
Unfortunately not.
Which brings us to the other people mentioned right at the top of this letter. Paul addresses Apphia and Archippus.
Right, in the opening greeting.
Now, historical analysis from our sources suggests Apphia is likely Philemon's wife. But why include her in what seems like a business or property dispute?
Because she is an injured party in this conflict, too.
Oh, true.
If you are trying to orchestrate a true reconciliation in a household, you don't just address the head of the estate.
You address the spouse, who also felt the sting of the betrayal.
Exactly. She likely managed the daily finances that were disrupted by all of this. Justice and prudence demand she be included.
And then there's Archippus. He's called a fellow soldier.
Yeah, likely a co-pastor or a minister in that exact same house church.
So Paul is involving all the key stakeholders in the community right from the jump.
He's building a coalition of influence.
He's getting everyone on the same page. And he needs that coalition because of the source of all this tension, which is Onesimus.
Yes, the runaway.
Right. So according to the historical context, Onesimus was a servant or perhaps a slave in Philemon's household, and he ran away.
And based on a very specific line later in the letter, there is a strong implication that he embezzled or stole from Philemon when he fled.
So he's a runaway, a thief, who navigates his way all the way to Rome.
And while hiding out in the massive swarming crowds of Rome, he somehow meets Paul in prison.
And then undergoes this complete radical life change.
It's a staggering sequence of events when you think about it.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Wait, so this is like a CEO's runaway assistant who embezzled company funds, fleeing to a totally different continent to hide.
Yeah, essentially.
And then randomly bumping into the CEO's highly respected spiritual mentor in a high-security prison.
That's the setup.
What are the actual odds of that happening? I mean, it sounds like bad fiction.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the setting itself is a profound lesson in what theologians refer to as providence.
Providence.
What appears to be a random, chaotic, and deeply painful series of events. A betrayal, a theft, a desperate flight across the Mediterranean.
Right, total chaos.
It is actually the exact, precise mechanism used to bring this runaway into contact with the one person who could facilitate his transformation.
Ow!
The tension is so thick precisely because Onesimus' betrayal happened in a place of supposedly high moral order.
Yeah, the house church.
He rebelled against the very environment that should have nurtured him, only to find his redemption in a literal prison cell hundreds of miles away.
That is just wild. So you have this runaway who has now become a deeply committed Christian under Paul's mentorship in prison?
And Paul is sending him back.
Which is the explosive reality in the room. A runaway returning to his offended, likely very angry, master.
Oh, Philemon was almost certainly furious.
So how on earth does Paul mediate this? Because he knows he can't just send a quick note saying, hey, forgive him, it's the right thing to do.
No, if he does that, the letter gets burned and Onesimus gets thrown in chains, or honestly, much worse.
So instead, Paul orchestrates what is essentially a psychological and spiritual masterclass in persuasion.
He really does. If you break down Paul's approach, it is an absolute clinic on how to handle explosive conflict.
And what's the first step?
The very first tactic, the foundation of the entire letter, is praise.
Praise for the guy who's been robbed.
Exactly. Before Paul asks for a single concession, he spends the opening verses highlighting Philemon's existing track record of love and faith.
Let me look at that text. Right, Paul says, I thank my God always, making mention of you in my prayers, hearing of your love and of the faith which you have toward the Lord Jesus and toward all the saints.
Notice what he does there. He starts by acknowledging the good. He doesn't lead with the problem. He leads with the person's character.
Which is brilliant.
And if you look at the original Greek here, where Paul prays that the fellowship of your faith may become effective, it reveals a lot.
Oh, I love looking at the original language. What's the word there?
The Greek word for fellowship or communication is koinonia. It implies this deep sharing, making your faith common to others through tangible good deeds.
Tangible good deeds. Okay.
And the word for effective is energis, which is where we get energetic or operative.
So he's saying his faith is active.
Right. Paul is essentially saying, I know you have this deep, energetic faith that expresses itself in radical love. I've seen it. The community has seen it.
It's just brilliant framing. He is reminding Philemon of who he is at his absolute best before asking him to do something incredibly difficult.
Exactly.
I mean, you don't start a hard conversation in the modern workplace or in a marriage with a list of demands. You start by affirming their best qualities.
You have to establish that baseline of respect first.
But, okay, let's unpack this. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. After this praise, Paul does something completely counterintuitive for someone in a position of power.
He waives his authority.
Yes, this is a pivotal moment in the rhetoric. Paul writes, "Therefore, though I have all boldness in Christ to command you that which is appropriate, yet for love's sake I rather appeal to you."
It's a huge shift in the dynamic.
But let me challenge that for a second. Wait, in the Roman world, power was everything, right? It was a strictly hierarchical society.
Very strict, yes.
So if Paul steps down from his apostolic authority, doesn't he just look weak?
You would think so, yeah.
Why would Philemon listen to someone who refuses to pull rank? If I'm the manager and an employee does something wrong, my instinct is to say, I'm your boss, do this. Why waive the one piece of leverage you supposedly have?
Because forced goodness isn't goodness.
Oh, say more about that.
If Paul commands Philemon to forgive Onesimus, Philemon might obey out of sheer duty. Or maybe fear of apostolic authority, or just social pressure from the house church.
Right, he'd do it through gritted teeth.
Exactly. His heart wouldn't be in it at all. He would harbor resentment. The fracture in the relationship wouldn't heal. It would just be covered by this thin bandage of compliance.
That makes so much sense. True reconciliation cannot be legislated.
It absolutely must be chosen. Paul wants Philemon's compliance to be, as he says later in the text, not as of necessity, but of free will.
So by waiving the authority, he's actually forcing Philemon to make a moral choice, rather than just following an order blindly.
Right. He appeals for love's sake.
And to add emotional weight to that appeal, he leans heavily into his own vulnerability, too.
He really does.
He says, being such a one as Paul, the aged, but also a prisoner of Jesus Christ. And historical timelines suggest Paul would be around, 60 years old here?
Yeah, around 60. But we have to remember, in the ancient world, that's not a spry, modern 60.
Not going to the gym every morning.
No, this is a 60-year-old whose physical constitution has been entirely broken by shipwrecks, beatings, starvation, and multiple imprisonments.
Wow, yeah. His body is just ruined at this point.
So the request of an aged, suffering mentor carries this emotional resonance that a sterile command simply lacks.
It's deeply personal.
Paul is saying, I'm old, my body is broken, I'm in chains for our shared faith. Please do this for me. It is a profoundly human, deeply relational appeal.
And then, and I love this, only after all this careful emotional preparation does he finally mention the name of the runaway.
It's all a setup.
In verse 10, he says, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whom I have become the father of in my chains. Now, you were telling me earlier about the tactical genius of the Greek sentence structure here.
Yes. Oh, it's so good. In the original Greek phrasing, the name Onesimus is deliberately held back to the very end of the sentence.
Really?
Yeah, the literal order is something like, I entreat thee concerning a son of mine, whom I have begotten in my bonds, Onesimus.
That is just brilliant. He redefines the relationship completely before Philemon even hears the trigger word.
Exactly.
Because if he had just started the letter saying, hey, I'm writing about Onesimus, Philemon's blood pressure would have instantly spiked.
Oh, he would have stopped reading. He would have immediately thought of the theft, the betrayal, the sheer embarrassment of a runaway.
But instead, Paul says, I'm writing about my son.
Right. Philemon has to process this new, deeply intimate spiritual relationship. This idea that this runaway is now Paul's spiritual child before the identity is finally revealed.
He focuses entirely on the transformation.
He doesn't minimize the past sin, but he absolutely refuses to sink Onesimus' spirit by endlessly burdening him with it.
And there's this subtle linguistic play happening right after, too, right?
The name pun.
Yes. Paul writes, who once was useless to you, but now is useful to you and to me.
It's so clever.
Because the name Onesimus literally translates to profitable or useful in Greek, right?
Yes, exactly.
So Paul is directly acknowledging the massive irony in the room. He's saying, look, the guy named Profitable was incredibly unprofitable to you in the past. He was a disaster.
But now he's actually living up to his name. He's very useful to both of us.
What's fascinating here is how Paul is systematically dismantling every single emotional and logical barrier Philemon might throw up.
Brick by brick.
He praises his character, he drops his own authority to prevent resentment, he appeals to love and pity for an old man, he completely redefines the offender's identity.
And he even uses a bit of gentle humor to de-escalate the tension.
It's amazing. But this raises an important question for you, the listener. How do we translate this into 21st century realities?
That's a great question.
Think about how we handle conflict today. If we're honest, our default mode is almost always to pull rank if we have it, or to focus entirely on our own rights and how deeply we've been wronged.
Right. We say, I am the manager, you breached protocol.
Or, I am the parent, this is the rule, we just demand compliance.
And it rarely works to actually heal the relationship. It might get the job done in the short term, but the relationship stays broken.
It really does.
It requires a massive paradigm shift. If you are mediating a dispute, or if you need someone to grant forgiveness, starting with a demand usually just breeds a counter-demand.
So true.
Paul teaches us to start by affirming shared values.
Right.
Acknowledge the good in the other person before addressing the bad. And whenever possible, waive your authority to appeal to mutual love and respect.
So here's a reflection for you, the listener, to try. Think of a conflict you are currently navigating.
We all have them.
Maybe someone you need to confront or someone you need to ask for a major, uncomfortable concession.
Yeah.
Instead of going in with a list of demands or a tight focus on your rights, how could you approach them by first affirming their best qualities? How could you appeal to them for love's sake rather than forcing their compliance?
It completely changes the architecture of the conversation.
It really does. But as beautiful as this rhetorical architecture is, we have to address the massive, profoundly uncomfortable obstacle sitting right in the middle of this text.
Yeah.
We can't ignore it.
We are talking about a first-century society where human beings were legally owned by other human beings.
Right.
Onesimus is a servant, and in the context of the Roman Empire, highly likely a slave.
Oh.
And Paul is sending him back to his master.
It's a very difficult reality to process.
Yeah, I have to push back hard here because this is a major stumbling block for modern listeners, and frankly, it should be.
Oh, absolutely.
It feels deeply offensive that a spiritual leader, someone talking about radical love, would send a runaway back into a brutal system of servitude.
It's jarring.
Why doesn't Paul use this moment to write a blistering condemnation of the institution of slavery and demand, and Philemon emancipate him immediately? Why play within the rules of such an evil system?
It is a vital question, and it requires a very careful, historically grounded deconstruction. We have to look at this impartially.
Right, because this text has been abused in the past, tragically misused. In later centuries, this specific letter was used to justify horrific systems of chattel slavery.
Which is just awful.
But historical and theological analysis from our sources attacks that justification head-on. First, we need to understand the economic and linguistic reality of Rome.
Okay. What does the word slave actually mean in this specific ancient context?
Well, the Greek word used here is doulos. It's a very broad term.
Broad how?
It was certainly applied to slaves, but it was also applied to hired servants, apprentices, or individuals legally bound to work off a massive debt.
Okay, that changes the nuance a bit.
Yeah, and in verse 18, Paul mentions that Onesimus might owe Philemon something, which could suggest a financial debt or a breach of a labor contract.
So he might not have been chattel property in the way we think of it.
Right. However, we have to concede that brutal involuntary slavery was rampant in the Roman Empire, so it's a very strong possibility that Onesimus was property.
Okay, so if he was, how do we justify Paul's actions?
The core theological argument is that even if Onesimus was a slave under Roman law, Paul's actions in this letter do not endorse the system. In fact, they fundamentally undermine it.
Because of the manner in which he is sent back, right? We have to remember Paul's situation. He has absolutely no civil authority.
None. He is a Roman magistrate.
He doesn't have a police force. He can't compel Onesimus to do anything.
Exactly. He didn't have him arrested by bounty hunters and extradited. Onesimus is returning voluntarily.
He is physically carrying this very letter in his own hands.
Which is incredible. Why would a runaway risk his life to voluntarily return to the scene of his crime?
Because he's a changed man.
Right. He likely felt profound moral obligation to repair the wrong he had done, to face the person he had injured, rather than living his life as a fugitive on the run.
And there's another vital piece of context here regarding Paul's own background. Paul was educated as a Hebrew, deeply trained in Old Testament law.
This is a really important point.
And if you look at Deuteronomy 23.15, it explicitly and strictly forbade returning a runaway slave to his master against his will.
Right. The law was very clear on that.
The text literally says, "You shall not deliver to his master a servant who has escaped from his master to you." So it is historically inconceivable that Paul, imbued with Hebrew law and preaching Christian grace, would force a man back into bondage against his will.
Which leads to the most subversive, radical part of the letter.
Yeah, let's look at that.
If Paul isn't endorsing the system, what is he actually doing? He tells Philemon in verse 16 to receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much rather to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord.
This is the verse that changes everything. And the best way I can explain it is to think of it like a computer virus of grace.
Oh, I love this analogy. Let's unpack that.
Okay, so the Roman Empire runs on the operating system of slavery. It is the economic hardware of the entire ancient world. The mines, the farms, the households, they all run on this brutal hardware.
Right. The whole economy depends on it.
Now, Paul doesn't attack the hardware directly with a violent political revolt. He's an old man in a prison cell. He has no army. He can't smash the system from the outside.
So what does he do?
Instead, he writes a single line of code, a software update, and uploads it straight into the center of Philemon's household. He is your equal, beloved brother.
That is brilliant. Because if that software runs, if Philemon actually installs that belief into his mind and heart, the hardware crashes.
Exactly.
You cannot logically, morally, or spiritually treat someone as a piece of property, as a chattel or a thing, if you genuinely view them as a beloved brother.
You just can't.
You can't beat an equal heir of heaven. You can't sell a member of your exact same spiritual family at the market.
The logic is undeniable. If Philemon followed the spirit of this letter, Onesimus could never again be regarded or treated as a slave.
Right, because if you treat someone as a Christian brother, you inherently recognize their human dignity, their right to freedom, their right to their own time and labor.
The principles laid down in this tiny personal letter, if universally applied, lead directly to the total abolition of the system.
This raises an important question about how societal change actually happens.
Yeah.
Sometimes direct political confrontation is the mechanism. But here, Paul is employing a deeply subversive internal mechanism.
A quiet revolution.
Yes. He isn't lobbying the emperor to change Roman law. He is dismantling the moral architecture within Philemon that makes the oppressive system possible in the first place.
Wow. He
is elevating Onesimus' humanity to a level that makes his continued subjugation literally impossible for anyone claiming to follow the way of Jesus.
It really requires wisdom with discernment for a modern reader to look at this text and not just see a man being sent back to his boss, but to see the explosive relational dynamic Paul is setting up.
It takes careful reading.
He is forcing Philemon into a corner where he must choose between the cultural economic norms of Roman property rights and the radical, leveling, uncomfortable demands of Christian brotherhood.
And having addressed that cultural obstacle, having navigated the minefield of Roman slavery, we can now move to what is arguably the deepest philosophical and theological insight of the entire letter.
Okay, I'm ready.
We have to ask, how does the universe use our catastrophic mistakes? And when a relationship is deeply broken, who actually pays the cost of restoring the peace?
Right. Let's look at verse 15. Paul writes, "For perhaps he was therefore separated from you for a while, that you would have him forever."
Perhaps. I love the humility in that word.
Yeah, he doesn't claim to know exactly what God is doing.
Right. Paul is looking at the wreckage of this relationship. He sees the theft, the running away, the intense anger, the broken trust, and he's trying to discern a larger pattern in the chaos.
This is the profound mystery of providence.
Exactly. The idea that a higher purpose often works directly through human error and failure.
It's like a huge thought.
What seemed like a criminal act, a massive financial and emotional loss for Philemon, was actually the exact sequence of events required to bring Onesimus to Rome, to meet Paul, to undergo a total spiritual awakening, and to be returned not just as a worker, but as an eternal brother.
It's amazing how delicately Paul frames this. Matthew Henry notes how tenderly Paul speaks here. He doesn't write, "He sinfully rebelled and aggressively robbed you."
No, he softens it.
He says, "He departed for a season." He's speaking so tenderly about the sins of someone who has genuinely repented.
Yeah.
The act was criminal, yes, and it hurt. But in the grand scheme of providence, it was a temporary, painful departure, engineered for an eternal, joyous reunion.
Think about how that reframes the way we view the failures, the departures, and the traumas in our own lives.
It changes everything.
We often view a painful break in a relationship as an unmitigated disaster. But what if it's a necessary catalyst? Sometimes the absolute worst thing that happens is the exact mechanism required for the ultimate restoration.
But, and I know I'm pushing back a lot today, acknowledging providence doesn't erase the practical reality of the damage done, right?
No, it doesn't.
There's still a debt. Onesimus still caused a massive loss. Philemon is still out whatever money was stolen.
Yes, the ledger is still unbalanced.
And this is where Paul makes a move that has massive cosmic theological implications. Let's look at verses 18 and 19. But if he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, put that to my account. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Here's where it gets really interesting.
He literally signs an IOU. He's an old man in a Roman prison. He likely has zero income, but he legally binds himself to a runaway's massive debt.
He does.
He says, whatever he stole, whatever labor he owes you, charge it to me.
This is the precise practical definition of the theological concept of imputation, or what is sometimes called suretyship.
Imputation, right.
The Greek term is elegao, to reckon, to put to one's account. And we need to understand how radical this is.
How so?
You cannot justly charge someone with a crime they didn't commit unless they voluntarily assume the liability.
Ah, I see.
Paul didn't steal the money. He didn't run away. He isn't blameworthy in the slightest. But he voluntarily steps directly into the place of the guilty party and says to the offended party, hold me responsible. Treat him as if he were me.
Which is the exact parallel of what Christians believe Jesus Christ did for humanity.
Perfectly parallel.
The core theology is that Christ is innocent, humanity is guilty and deeply in debt, but Christ steps in and says, put their debt on my account.
That's the heart of the gospel.
Paul is taking this massive, high-minded, cosmic theological concept of salvation and acting it out in a localized, gritty, awkward dispute over stolen silver.
He isn't just preaching it, he's living it.
He is physically modeling it in real time.
He is absorbing the cost of the offense. But he does it with a brilliant rhetorical twist at the very end of verse 19.
Oh, this part is my favorite.
Right after formally promising to repay the debt, he adds in parentheses, almost as an afterthought, not to mention to you that you owe to me even your own self besides.
The gentle guilt trip? I absolutely love this. It's so human.
I love that part, yeah.
He's saying, look, I'll pay you back whatever he stole. I'll write the check. Although, if we're actually keeping score here, Philemon, you owe me your eternal soul because I'm the one who led you to faith.
But sure, I'll reimburse you for the petty cash.
Exactly. It is modesty and self-praise, but it acts as a massive lever of grace.
Paul is forcefully reminding Philemon of the staggering grace he has already received.
Right.
How can Philemon stubbornly demand strict financial or punitive repayment from Onesimus when he himself is the recipient of such an incalculable spiritual debt?
A debt owed to Paul and ultimately to God.
It's a masterful psychological way of shrinking the perceived size of Onesimus's offense by placing it directly next to the sheer magnitude of Philemon's own spiritual rescue.
It forces Philemon to view the conflict not through the cold lens of a ledger book, but through the warm lens of grace.
Right.
I mean, if I've been forgiven a $1 billion debt, how can I choke my brother over a $20 debt?
You can't. Not with a clear conscience.
So we've seen Paul's approach. It's a masterpiece. But is it completely unique? To really appreciate the brilliance of this, we need to look at how the rest of the ancient world handled this exact scenario.
And historical analysis from Barnes provides a fascinating comparative insight here.
Let's look at sacred versus profane wisdom. During this same general era, Pliny the Younger, a very prominent Roman author, lawyer, and magistrate, wrote a famous letter dealing with an almost identical situation.
This comparison is invaluable. It shows us the highest, most noble ideals of Roman secular philosophy placed side by side with the Christian ethic Paul is employing.
So what was Pliny's situation?
Pliny writes to his friend Sabinianus to plead for a freedman, a former slave, who had deeply offended Sabinianus and was cast out of his house.
I want to read a translated portion of Pliny's letter because the contrast with Paul is just striking.
Yeah, read that for us.
Listen to how a brilliant Roman lawyer handles it. Pliny writes, "He wept much, pleaded much, and yet pleaded more by his silence. In short, he fully convinced me that he is a penitent. I know that thou art incensed against him, and I know also that thou art justly so. But then clemency has its chief praise when there is the greatest cause for anger. Forgive something for his youth, forgive on account of his tears. I will write them prayers, and the more largely and earnestly too, as I have sharply and severely reproved him, solemnly threatening him, should he offend again, nevermore to intercede for him.
From a literary standpoint, it's a beautifully written letter. It's a masterpiece of Roman rhetoric and logic.
It's very persuasive.
Pliny appeals to Sabinianus's noble sense of clemency. He leans on the youth of the offender. And notice how he emphasizes his own harshness toward the man. I sharply reproved him and threatened him.
Right. Pliny is essentially saying, look, I scared him straight, I yelled at him, I put the fear of the gods into him, so now it is socially fitting for you, as an elite Roman, to show mercy.
But when you analyze the underlying psychology, when you dig into the why of Pliny's letter compared to Paul's, you see exactly what's missing in the secular approach.
And what's missing?
Pliny relies entirely on philosophical clemency and the social obligation of the elite class to occasionally be merciful to their inferiors.
Okay.
But there is absolutely no shared kinship. Pliny doesn't call the offending freedman his son. He certainly doesn't tell Sabinianus to receive the man as a beloved brother.
And he absolutely does not offer to pay the man's debts. He doesn't say, put his offenses on my account.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is the stark difference between secular mitigation and sacred transformation.
Secular mitigation versus sacred transformation. I like that.
Pliny is managing a social dispute to maintain the status quo. Paul is elevating a social dispute into a cosmic reality.
That's a huge difference.
Why does Pliny's approach create a fragile peace?
No.
Because it relies on the offender staying terrified and the master feeling magnanimous. It is inherently asymmetrical.
Right, there's a clear power imbalance.
But why does Paul's approach create robust, lasting peace?
Yeah.
Because it relies on radical equality. It relies on an eternal brotherhood.
Yeah.
Pliny's letter might repair a temporary social dynamic. Paul's letter completely rewires the fundamental identities of everyone involved.
Pliny wants the freedman to behave so the Roman machine runs smoothly. Paul wants Onesimus and Philemon to recognize they are spiritual equals, which fundamentally breaks the Roman machine.
The contrast just highlights how truly radical, how disruptive Paul's approach was in the ancient world.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask how this ancient subversive text translates to our lives right now.
Because we aren't in the first century Roman Empire?
No.
Oh.
We don't have house churches in Colossae. But the mechanics of human conflict, of debt, betrayal, and forgiveness, those are identical.
Human nature hasn't changed.
Let's translate this to modern realities. Think about the 21st century workplace, or a leadership environment, or even a broken family dynamic. How do we view people who have deeply failed us? An employee who made a massive, costly mistake. A business partner who breached a contract. A family member who lied.
It's tough.
Do we label them permanently unprofitable, just like Onesimus was labeled? Do we write them off? Or do we believe, as Paul did, in their capacity for radical transformation?
To do what Paul did requires looking past the immediate glaring failure and seeing the potential of the person. It means not defining them entirely by their worst moment.
Right.
But the application of this letter goes even deeper than just offering second chances. Look at the accountability metric Paul sets up in verse 22.
What does he say there?
He writes, "Also prepare a guest room for me, for I hope that through your prayers I will be restored to you."
This is wild to me.
Why?
Well, Henry notes the Greek word there is aenia, which means guest right or hospitality. It was a massive cultural duty. But think about the audacious timing of this request.
Oh, yeah.
Paul has just spent an entire letter asking Philemon to do something incredibly painful and hard to swallow his pride, absorb a financial loss, forgive a runaway thief, and embrace him as an equal brother.
That's a huge ask.
And immediately after asking that, Paul says, oh, and by the way, fluff the pillows in the guest room because I'm coming to visit.
It is the ultimate accountability metric.
It really is.
Paul is saying, I'm not just tossing this letter into the void from my prison cell. I expect to arrive soon. And I expect to sit at your dining table right alongside you and Onesimus.
He's going to check up on them.
It brings a profound physical level of reality to the request. He is going to verify the reconciliation in person.
Which forces us to ask a really uncomfortable practical question for you as a listener. Are our own homes, our own lives, genuinely open to reconciliation?
Can we sit at a table, share a meal, and look the people we've been in conflict with in the eye?
That's the real test.
And Paul also asks for their prayers in that same breath. I hope that through your prayers I will be restored to you.
Right, he's asking for spiritual support.
He is an apostle, a spiritual giant, but he acknowledges that he desperately needs them. He is isolated in prison, and he relies on the intercession of his community.
That's a great point.
It's a reminder that we all need community to survive our personal prisons, whether those are literal jail cells or the prisons of depression, grief, or isolation.
He needs them, and he believes in them. Paul ends his core requests with a statement of profound psychological insight in verse 21. Having confidence in your obedience, I write to you, knowing that you will do even beyond what I say.
The sheer power of positive expectations.
Yeah.
Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't threaten Philemon. He doesn't say, if you don't do this, you're excommunicated. I'll ruin your reputation.
He doesn't resort to fear.
No. He says, I know you. I know your deep character. I know you're going to do even more than I'm asking.
It's the Pygmalion effect in ancient literature. When you set a high moral expectation for someone, when you treat them as if they are already their best self, they almost always rise to meet it.
This raises a vital question for application, especially if you ever find yourself in the position of mediating a dispute between two friends or two colleagues or two family members.
Okay, what's the question?
How can you act as the Paul in that situation? Are you willing to absorb some of the cost, whether that's emotional energy, time, reputation, or even practical financial resources, to help them reconcile?
Wow.
Are you willing to say, put that on my account, to bridge the massive gap between them?
Okay, let's unpack that for a second, because that is incredibly hard. I think most of us, when we mediate, we just want to be a neutral referee blowing a whistle from the sidelines.
Yeah, we don't want to get our hands dirty.
We say, you say you're sorry, you say you forgive them, now shake hands. But to mediate like Paul means you have to have actual skin in the game.
You do.
You have to love both parties enough to leverage your own relationship with them, your own capital, to force a peace. That is a heavy, heavy lift.
It is, because true peace is rarely cheap. Someone usually has to willingly absorb the debt of the offense.
Right. Paul absorbed the debt for Onesimus. Christ absorbed the debt for humanity.
If we want to be peacemakers, we have to be willing to absorb the relational cost.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Book of Philemon, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We've seen the masterful psychological persuasion.
We've seen the profound theology of grace, providence, and imputation.
We've seen the subtle dismantling of social barriers that crashed the system of slavery. But notice how the letter actually ends.
It just ends.
Yeah. Verse 25 gives the final spiritual greeting, and that's it. The text never actually tells us what Philemon decided to do.
The historical silence is deafening. We have no record. Did he embrace Onesimus? Did he tear up the letter in a rage?
We don't know, but that silence is profoundly intentional for us today as readers. It leaves the ending unwritten, because the ending is always happening right now in your life.
The script of reconciliation has been beautifully written.
The debt of the offense has been covered. But the final choice, to actually open the door, to let go of the right to be angry, to absorb the cost, to receive the offender not as a problem but as a brother, that choice always rests in your hands.
Who is the Onesimus in your life right now? The person who wronged you, who you've written off as unprofitable.
If someone came to you today and said, receive them as you would receive me, what would you choose to do when they show up at your door? That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.